This is Off Planet Radio.
And welcome to the show, The Eye of the Needle 2024. The Great Awakening is here, folks. Smile your way through it. It's not what you thought. Anyway, those who have watched the show for a long time know what the Eye of the Needle is. That's been our predictive arc since 2019, so 5 years. Yeah, that's about right. Anyway, I'm Randy Maugans, and this is Off Planet Radio. Back with a smile. Glad to be here. And I have a guest with me today, and we're going to talk about something that needs more discussion, and that's, I'm calling this a journey through loss, grief, and trauma. And my guest today comes to us from literally my own backyard. I encountered her practice. I will put it right up front that she is my therapist, and that I've been in treatment, I guess, about a year and a half now, going on almost 2 years, dealing with, as I've talked about on the show before, sexual trauma and abuse as a child. And of course, the long-term illness that I've gone through, that I'm coming back from, and many other losses and things in my life have caused me to pause and reflect a bit about what we go through in our journeys. And that's exactly the way this is characterized. It's a journey. And an old saying my granddaddy used to use, when everything looks like a nail, the only thing you have is a hammer. Sometimes you have to approach problems that appear to be problems from a different angle. My guest is Lisa Zoll. She is a native of my own backyard here in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania. She got her master's degree from Temple University in Harrisburg in 2003. She spent 12 years as a clinical psychiatric specialist at the Penn State University Medical Center in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And she worked there during that time in the adult partial hospitalization and psychiatric outpatient clinic. In 2008, she taught loss and grief as an adjunct instructor in the Master of Social Work at Temple University, Harrisburg. And in 2014, she became a full-time faculty instructor, covering the academic area as well as the clinical. She worked also as a volunteer firefighter and EMT, and she has used that experience, merging it all together in providing mental health services for first responders. She founded her current practice, Grief Relief, in 2019, and specializes in helping patients challenged by loss, grief, and trauma. We welcome, with that long introduction, Lisa Zoll. Welcome to Off Planet Radio.
Yeah, thanks, Randy. I'm here with a smile, as you started out with saying, so I think I'll follow suit with that. I like it.
Yeah. So we kind of recapped a little bit of your background there, which sometimes I miss details, but I think we got the highlights of it. I think the important thing is what I tried to bring out in the introduction, looking at grief from a different perspective, because grief encompasses a whole lot of things. It includes trauma and loss and sorrow and all of these things that we feel. You know, in a sense, our culture right now is, in a sense, a state of collective shock in many ways. What a writer years ago, Alvin Toffler, termed future shock. Well, the future arrived and we weren't ready. So on the broad side of things, we can all look at this with open eyes because we're all going through some sort of shared experiences together, whether it's the aftershock of COVID-19 or the shifts in the economic climate, the jigs and jags of the political landscape. All these things have served to kind of move us into a place of anxiety, tension, and even a sense of loss over, the way things are changing. But we're going to talk on an individual level as well, Lisa, about how you deal with your patients, and specifically individual patients and then first responders. I know that's a lot to unpack. Let's
Yeah.
start with the individual grief and the people who come to you and how they begin to unpack this journey, how
Okay.
you help them.
Well, I think that it's important that that I kind of clarify the grief that I end up treating a lot of is, well, we have both death and non-death related grief.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so we end up treating when I first started, I thought I'm gonna treat people with grief because I had some losses when I was, younger, and nobody talked about it. Randy, we don't talk about.
We don't talk about it. No, it's swept
No,
under the carpet.
yeah, we don't talk about death and loss and how to handle it. And I had some significant losses. I lost a person that was very much like a grandmother to me, and it was super, super painful. And I didn't understand what was happening. I didn't understand why I was felt the way I did. And we didn't really talk about it either. My parents, I think they were trying to be protective, more protective than anything. So it was not easy to talk about. So I ended up reaching out to a chaplain. You said I worked at the med center. I ended up reaching out to a chaplain there who kind of helped me understand that I had some unresolved grief after, some things had happened. And I thought, wow, okay, so what do I do? And we kind of worked through that. She said, you can write a letter, whatever she kind of guided me a little bit through the process. And I kind of was thinking, I really want to be able to do that for people on some level. And that was way back before I even went back to school, to graduate school for my social work degree. So what I realized then, as I said, okay, I'll help people with grief. But what people were coming in with was not just grief, like they lost their grandmother. It was traumatic grief. They lost somebody, in a very terrible or traumatic way, horrific
Mm-hmm.
accident,
Mm-hmm.
some kind of sudden death. And so I started seeing like it wasn't just grief, it was trauma and grief. And then, I stumble upon the word traumatic grief. So I'm like, okay, this is where it's at for me. And this is the niche that I need to fill, is for people that have traumatic grief. And my idea basically was to provide a space for adults. I think there's a lot done for kids, which is great. I don't work with kids. I think I would do more harm than good, to be honest. Even though my office may not reflect that, but
Yeah,
on my
more
Legos.
toys than Captain Kangaroo, I can tell you that.
I know it's crazy, but I mean, they're just little things that I have around here. I don't know, touchstones, I guess.
Yeah,
And so yeah, there's a lot for kids. I mean, I was looking at the caring place and how there's that's a place for kids to go and work through their losses,
right.
but there was no place for adults that I knew of and that really specialized in grief that I could find in this area that was specifically grief therapy. So I kind of created that niche on purpose because it was my interest first. And second, I thought it would be better to try to fill a niche than be like a broad and generalist, if
Right,
that
right.
makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
When you talk about traumatic grief, you encounter a whole range of emotions within that context. And some of it is denial and some of it is affirmation. And your job is to kind of help separate out and work people through whatever process is required. We're going to get to EMDR a little later because I want to go
Sure.
into that a little bit more. But in general, we were sold this idea of stages of grief. That probably is not a model anymore that serves us well.
Right. And I think, I think it's been misconstrued sometimes because we talk about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross,
Hmm.
1969. on death and dying. And she
Great
wrote this book.
stuff.
Yeah, and
Groundbreaking. Yes.
important work. But what people didn't fail to realize moving forward with that is that she was writing that book from the perspective of people who were in the dying.
Exactly.
Right. So then, but we just said, well, that probably works for people after, after somebody dies. They probably go through some stages of grief and they could be the same. But, when some of the things that I've read is once somebody dies, one of the stages is bargaining. And once somebody dies and you're grieving, there's nothing left to bargain with. So the bargaining is replaced by anxiety.
Yeah.
And the anxiety is a result of the separation, right? So it's
Right.
almost like a separation anxiety, if that
Separation
makes sense.
anxiety. Yeah.
So what I worked with a friend of mine who lost both of her children. Her children died at the hands of her ex-husband, who took their lives and then his own. And we came up with what we believe is a little bit more realistic for the work I do. And we identified that there's an event that happens, some sort of event happens in your life, and there's the work that you do to try to figure out how to make meaning out of it, to make sense out of it, to benefit finding, something that will make it make sense to you. There's the event, there's the work, and then there's forever. Because they think about there's really no closure to grief. It changes and it shifts its forms, but we don't really ever close the book on it. Once we lose somebody, we're always going to probably miss them in some way, shape, or form, although that will shift over time.
Yeah. It's a hole. It's a hole in our spirit, I guess.
No, that's a good way to put it.
Sense of loss. You're not going to fill that hole. But looking at it, we've talked about this before about the river concept of basically moving down river and all of the things that are there on the bottom of the river that are impeding our flow, that are keeping us from moving forward, because that's really what we're talking about, is moving forward.
Right. Yes, for sure. And that's where, when I was trying to come up with, I don't know how, I just came up with grief relief. It rhymed, I guess. But I needed a tagline for that. And the tagline is looking back, living forward. And both things can be true at once. Like two things can be true at once. We can look back on what we've lost with memories and with pain and memories. We can have both. And we can also live forward and figure out how we're going to accommodate that loss and figure out how to live without the person physically here or the place physically here. Think about, you were talking about the things that are going on in the world. Think about the people in Florida and North Carolina and those hurricanes.
Yeah, tremendous loss.
And the grief and of the places, not only the people that have been lost, but the places that have been lost, the homes, everything. So, you have massive amounts of loss and grief there. So it's death of people, perhaps, but it's also non-death related in terms of places and things.
Yeah, I actually have friends down there, listeners of this show. We spent time down there at Lake Lure, which is, just outside of town. And it's a tremendously beautiful area. It's a very old traditional area. And my heart goes out to you folks out there, by the way.
Certainly.
And, we'll pray that you've made it through at least this far. And hopefully we can give you some comfort talking about this. Because that's a loss. It's a grief right there. Even if you didn't lose a loved one, you lost possessions, you lost memories, you lost maybe a house. And it's tremendous shock.
And they were on the news, they're talking about, people going back to their houses and the things that they were thinking about, how identifying things that can't be replaced. And we know that. And, what do you do with all that then? How do you sift through all of that devastation?
We know because we had these kind of floods here in the Susquehanna Valley, I guess almost 50 years ago. with her
72.
72,
Yeah.
Hurricane Agnes over 50 years ago.
Hmm.
And it was an historic flood. And, nobody's safe from the assault of nature. When Mother Nature moves, anything that's in her way is moving with her. And so, you
Good
know,
point.
the light, that's the light side of that, but I don't mean to make light of it in the sense of, people's loss and sense of grief over what is now they've incurred.
Hmm.
So in replacing this concept of stages of grief, we kind of come to a place where you're kind of multidimensional in your therapy. You kind of go with the flow of what can work. Place where a lot of people grew up with a strong heritage. So constructively, going through therapy sometimes involves a fair amount of talk therapy, as well as what we're going to talk about next, which is the EMDR, which is one of the reasons why I wound up in your office. I don't know if you were aware that I had researched for several years finding a practitioner who could do EMDR to help me.
Hmm.
And that at the time it looked like I was going to have to drive 60 miles south into York County, almost to the Maryland state line, in order to find a therapist to be able to do this. And it was such a joy and such a blessing to find you and to find that I was going to be able to get EMDR treatment. And that's
Yeah.
one of the things that your practice is really, really leading the edge with right now.
Yeah, doing the EMDR training, I think is probably, I was telling somebody today, was probably one of the best things I did after graduate school. And I wasn't sold on it, Randy. I was very skeptical of the whole thing. I had an intern that I was working with, and she was really into it, and she wanted to get trained, and she wanted to do do all the she wanted to start doing it as an intern. And I'm like, I don't even know what this is, let alone, and it sounds like, to me, it was like, is this like woo-woo stuff? I don't understand it, because it didn't make sense to me, because I hadn't done enough research on it, really. So she got trained, and she started doing it with some of our really patients that had some significant trauma. And I saw it work, and I thought, oh man, I can't not get trained if this is something that is going to really help people. And at that time, wasn't really even working with first responders, which is where I found it to be very, really helpful, because getting people just in and out of the office and treatment. And then once I took the training and started doing it, I really found out how effective it can be in helping people move trauma. The way I describe it is that unprocessed trauma sits in the front of our brain with the volume turned up, and it demands our attention. Processed trauma moves to the back of our brain, and I don't know enough about the brain to explain all this, but somehow it moves to the back of our brain. Neural pathways open up through this bilateral stimulation that we do, and the trauma is, as it's processed, moves to the back of the brain with the volume turned down. It doesn't mean you forget it. It just means you don't sit in it, and it doesn't have the charge that it had before it was processed.
Which is exactly what we were talking about in your approach towards therapy with your grief patients,
Mhm.
is moving that to a place where it doesn't dominate anymore. What
Right.
EMDR is an acronym. Can you tell us what that means?
Eye movement desensitization reprocessing.
Yeah, it comes from a German term, I think.
Yeah. The So Francine Shapiro,
Okay.
um, she was the person that kind of started this all. She's from Canada.
Okay.
Um, she had, I believe I'm going to say she had cancer, but I'm not 100% sure of that. But she was feeling badly one day. And so she took a walk. She's a psychologist, I believe. And of course, analyzing everything. And she was thinking about, she came back and she felt better. And she said, well, what did I do that helped? And part of what she realized she was doing was she was scanning the environment back and forth. Like, if you're walking down a street, like, you're kind of looking at both sides of the street, I guess. So
You're
I'm picturing
using
her.
eye
Yeah, go ahead.
movement
Mhm.
sideways. Yeah,
Yeah.
back and forth.
Yeah, I'm picturing her walking through a park or something and just kind of scanning her environment. So they started to study it and decided, it was the bilateral stimulation. And that can create, I don't, people have seen the tapping that people
Right.
do. That's bilateral stimulation. There's a light bar where you follow the light back and forth with your eyes. You keep your head still and follow the light. And we also have pulsers that you can hold in your hands. They vibrate back and forth very much like like a cell phone. It feels like the
Right.
vibration feels like a cell phone. And so we create the bilateral stimulation, and that's what helps move the trauma.
So at this point, I'll talk a little bit about my experience with it, which was over several sessions. I want to say probably 3 concentrated sessions that you and I did together
Mhm.
around things related to the sexual abuse that I experienced between the ages of 10 and 11.
Mhm.
And that's led to a lot of distortion, I think, in my own emotional landscape as well. It was very confusing and it was unresolved. It was never discussed. It was never talked about again after this whole thing came out. This was sort of a scandal that was contained in a small town. And as a result of that, I spent a lot of years with a lot of feelings of worthlessness and shame and neglect as a result of not resolving this issue. And it was brought forward as I got older to the point where I realized I have to deal with this. In order to be healthy again, in any way, shape, or form, I have to deal with this. And so through those sessions in EMDR, then we began to unpack this. And using the EMDR, the bilateral stimulation, enabled us to kind of go back and scene play, so to speak, so that I basically could, for the first time, stand up for myself as that 10 to 11-year-old boy who was being abused by this very nasty man.
Mhm.
And I want to say this, that everybody's experiences are different, but I felt tremendous release as a result of those sessions. I felt like for the first time in my life, I empowered that child again. I empowered that child who was me. In a sense, kind of what we're doing is it's river of time. We're going back
Mhm.
and changing the past in a way that creatively alters the present because we've resolved the conflict that occurred. I
Right.
think that's probably a fairly good way to explain what I experienced.
Yeah, I think it's excellent. And I think, to add to that is when we do the protocol, like there's a protocol that we go through, a treatment plan that we develop about a target that we want, which,
Mhm.
as you noted, yours was your sexual abuse when you were 10 or 11 years old. And along with that comes an image that you described. What image came to mind when you think about those incidents? And there's also, this is the big one, a negative belief about ourselves as a result of that.
Yeah.
And many times I blame ourselves for the trauma that somebody else inflicted on us because we feel like for some reason I must have done something wrong. I did something wrong. That's another common one.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the goal, the goal then is to identify what would you prefer to believe about yourself now, instead of I can't stand up for myself when you're a 10 or 11-year old. And maybe now you're thinking, well, what I would like to believe is I can stand up for myself. And so we work through the process, and try to move things along till that becomes a more realistic belief, rather than you doing something wrong and you can't stand up for yourself. You really didn't do anything wrong. People that are abused haven't done anything wrong, and they couldn't stand up for themselves because they were in such a position where the other person had more power. And so, yeah, the moving those beliefs and reframing and reprocessing those beliefs is part of the process of EMDR.
Yeah, this is what successful therapy can achieve with a practitioner that takes the time to go through the process along with a patient, it's a mutual effort. The
For
patient and
sure.
the practitioner both have to be willing participants in a scenario that
Hmm.
ultimately unlocks whatever it is. In my case, I blamed myself for this.
Right.
Inherently, I felt deep down inside that somehow I either deserved this, I caused it. It was part of something that I initiated as a result of who I was.
Hmm.
And when you live with that for a long time, your sense of self-worth, your identity takes a beating,
Hmm.
and it comes back in seemingly tricky little ways to kind of haunt you.
Hmm.
And I reached a point in my life, which was a crisis point, which, you know, that's a whole other discussion, but we know that we go through parts of our lives where there are crisis points or tipping points, places where there's a cumulative effect that occurs. You
Right.
know, not everybody has it. They call it a midlife crisis. That's kind of a misnomer
Yeah, for sure.
as well. But in unpacking all of this, it's not something that you can do in isolation. I know I tried. I tried dealing with this for years on my own and with other therapies.
Hmm.
And the most successful therapy was the one that finally left me go back and recreate something that happened that was traumatic, shocking, and very damaging,
Hmm.
and enabled me to be empowered again in a way that
Yeah.
I can't quite describe it to this day, Lisa. Uh,
No.
the liberation that you feel when you unlock that final veil that's been thrown over it, of being able to gain power again.
It is, it's so interesting, Randy. And I think the trust has to be mutual between,
Yeah,
between the therapist and the client, because as you remember, I'm asking you to do things that are uncomfortable, like to go back into that place, can you go back? Can you talk to your younger self? Is there anything that your younger self needed? And it's kind of about I trust the process, and in turn you trusted the process, and so it works,
yeah, yeah.
and just in regular, when you're doing just talk therapy, whatever approach you're using. I remember teaching that to students. It's like, trust the process. You might get in a space where you feel stuck sometimes and you're not sure what to do. Stick with it and trust the process. And I think that same is true for EMDR, where there's a process that goes on. There's a treatment plan and there's a protocol, but there's also what they call cognitive interweaves, which are kind of they're kind of the thing that makes it more personalized. Like when you're with somebody and you're asking them to talk to their younger self, that's to help heal that part of you, right? That's
Right, right.
to kind of come beside yourself, and you have to trust that it sounds weird, right? It sounds like, what? But then most people are like, okay, I'll do it. And I'll see what I can do. And it often, as if they're willing, it does work. And most people that I've worked with have been willing to kind of step into that space. And I think it's tough. It's tough
It's
work,
tough.
as you know.
It's brave work.
Very,
It's
very.
very brave work for anybody that wants to do it, that goes through it.
Hmm.
And I think for the therapist, because there's no small amount of little perils involved in doing this. You know,
Hmm.
it's messy. It's like
Hmm.
life itself. We were talking earlier about grief and loss, and how you can't put that stone back in the wall. You know, that loss is there. It's
Hmm.
just how conscious you are of the loss and how it impacts you on a certain level. And if it's debilitating, which I've seen this, I've experienced paralysis as a result of loss,
Hmm.
relationship.
Right.
And when your entire life starts kind of falling down around you, I guess, is when most people finally realize that they have something that they need to deal with.
Abused, sexually abused, or in other ways abused, often that doesn't come out till people are later in their life, like
Much
in
like,
their
yeah.
50s. Like I think it was like 52 or something, that people is that kind of an average age where people say, oh, maybe it's time to deal with this. Like they might have sat on that secret, they kept that secret, maybe told very few people.
That was
And
me.
yeah. And then you think, well, I can't keep living like this. I think it eats away at you. I think that,
So interesting
yeah.
because it really surfaced again. This would have been at least 15 years ago when my mother got terminally ill before she
Hmm.
passed away. She was diagnosed and passed away within 90 days of diagnosis for pancreatic cancer. She had stage 4.
Mm.
And spending time with my mom during that period, there was a lot of things we had to talk about. I was her trustee. I was the person that was taking care of her affairs. But we got into discussing some things such as the situation with childhood sexual abuse. What did she remember about it? What did she know about it? She was very reluctant to talk about this.
Hmm.
But for me, that was the beginning then of this kind of opening up in my life again. It's like her passing was the signal for me to not leave this world with the same regrets that I think she experienced as a result of things in her life.
Hmm.
In other words, there's kind of, uh, I believe it's true when the Bible says the sins of the fathers or the mothers or whatever. In a
Hmm.
sense, there's a lineage to all of this because trauma gets passed on, or the after effects, the debris from trauma get passed on.
And they call it intergenerational trauma.
Right.
So yeah, and that makes sense because also when you think about it, trauma changes our brain and our brain chemistry. So if your mom had a trauma and she's passing on genetically, to you, maybe some of that, the trauma, not the she's not giving you trauma, but the maybe makes you more vulnerable to trauma. Let's put it
That's
that way.
my theory. Yeah. And I've talked to other therapists about this, and including one who was into some pretty archetypal stuff, who said basically this was just something that was in the void. It gets kind of woo-woo after a while.
Mm-hmm.
In terms
Okay.
of a predisposition, we'll call it that because it sounds a little more scientific, I guess.
Yeah.
We're predisposed to it. And I don't know exactly how that works. I know that in my family that there were other males who were experienced some form of sexual assault, including my younger brother. So there is all sorts of little perils involved in all of this.
Mhm.
Let's talk a little bit about your work with first responders, because I know that's sort of a very special part of your practice to you, having worked as a firefighter and an EMT uh, before. You received an informed background in dealing with the trauma that is experienced by first responders, firefighters, military, police.
Mhm.
Um,
I think, well, you know what? I had no clue that my experience back in the late 80s and early 90s would come back in this way. I really enjoyed my time, as as being a volunteer firefighter. It worked for me. I was in college. I stayed home. I went to Hack and Penn State Harrisburg. I was working at a nursing home where one of the people that worked there, her brother and her husband were the first paid EMTs for the Camp Hill Fire
ah,
Department.
okay.
And so she was always going, they had drill night on Monday nights. So she was going there and I'm like, take me with you, take me with you. I want to, I want to see what this is all about. So I started going and I kind of got the bug, got the fever for, the adrenaline rush that happens when a call comes. Um, I was I was an EMT. I drove the ambulance, which was really cool. And and also I did firefighting. I did respond to some firefighting, some house fires and different fires. Also was part of the Camp Hill prison riots. I didn't cause the riots. I was there, standing around the perimeter of the Camp Hill prison back in the '89, I think that was.
Wow, yeah,
Uh,
that's right.
yeah, so that's sort of what I use as my street cred. Um, so I had 6 years of that, and my life. I graduated. My life kind of changed, and the last call I was on was a double fatality. Well, it was probably one of the last calls, and maybe the one that helped make the decision to kind of to be done. It was a double fatality on 581. And the thing that stuck with me on that was I didn't treat any of the patients that were on the scene. Um, but I was sitting in the middle of the road, middle of the highway on a tarp, and we had all our equipment, the jaws of life and all the
Mhm.
equipment that people that you would use on an accident scene. And what had happened was a truck came down, or the pressure that was on him from the cab of his truck. So I'm hearing the stories of how, we need to call his wife and we need to, when we lift this off of him, he's going to die because of that was what was keeping him alive. Like,
Right, exactly.
I'm not sure what they call that, but it was the pressure of that. And I thought,
Compressive force.
yeah, yeah. And I thought, man, that sucks. That sucks so bad. He's alive. They had to get him out of there. And I think they got him out, and I think he made it to the hospital. I think they took him to Hershey, but he didn't live long after that. And I just felt horrible. I thought, this is a really horrible thing. This guy's alive. He's talking to these people, but he's going to die. He's going to
Mhm.
die as soon as when they try to take him out of there. And that was enough for me. That was enough because there's so much cumulative trauma that happens in the first responder world because, we're not responding to good things. We're responding to people's, they talk about, we're responding to people on their worst day, when they're really sick or when their house is on fire, they've been in a terrible accident. And, that was just kind of enough for me at that point. Um, but I still, I'd hear the siren go off, or I'd hear, you hear the lights and sirens, and you're like, oh, I wonder where they're going, kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Hmm.
So, come full circle here. 2 years ago, got involved with a program in Cumberland County called the First Responder Assistance Program, which provides 10 free sessions to any first responder in Cumberland County that need it. And we're getting much better now at recognizing the trauma that first responders carry with them from call to call to call to call. And so that is where I found like the EMDR has come in so handy because by and large, first responders want to come in. They don't want to come in. If they do come in, they want to get out as soon as, they want to be able to get back on the job. They want to stay on the job for the most part. And so with EMDR, we've been able to keep the sessions relatively, we can treat people in 6 sessions maybe. And if there's no other underlying issues, they go back to their job for the most part with,
Hmm.
like you said, with the weight lifted. Um, so that has kind of been really helpful. And the other thing that's been really helpful is there's a push for this now for first responders,
Yeah.
especially for police. They're doing a lot of wellness checks and debriefings that they didn't used to do. And that's, we're trying to be more preventative, instead of responsive to what could happen after these calls that they go on.
If you think about it, um, I understand because I've had friends that were police officers. That's what one of my friends called hours of boredom and seconds of terror. But the
That makes sense,
the seconds of terror are cumulative.
for
And
sure.
I had a friend who had his partner shot and killed in a bank robbery. And I don't know that he ever dealt with that. He sort of barreled it up inside of himself. And
Which yeah,
this was back in the 80s, so we were in a different place in terms of therapy at that time.
for sure. Sure.
We we've really made a lot of progress collectively. And I can say this as an observer of psychology. The psychology has pushed itself out of the ivory towers and become more street level, which is kind of where you come into all this. Because
Hmm.
you're very much a street warrior in terms of therapy. I can see that. I can see that in your practice. I can see that in the people in your office that there's this sense both of a mission and camaraderie as well.
Hmm. For sure. And I think that's so important for people to come into this office and not feel like it's so sterile and clinical. Like we have a dog, we have little Riley, and she's here, and I mean, I don't know, I just have stuff here that makes me feel like that people have noticed and has commented that it doesn't feel sterile. It doesn't feel like you're coming into necessarily a clinical, like completely clinical office. I mean, we have offices, we have all the regular stuff that an office would have, but it's not sterile at all.
No, I can testify to that.
Right.
And to the effectiveness of having a little Riley running around that kind of disrupts sometimes our serious modes that we
Yeah,
have.
because she wants in.
Yeah, because she's part of the practice.
Hmm.
She's a big part of the practice. She's the
She's
smile, the wagging tail.
she's the smallest one in the practice and maybe has the biggest impact sometimes.
Overall, w- would you say you find it more gratifying now, Lisa, to be doing what you're doing as opposed to academia?
Hmm. Yeah, I academia was not for me. Um, It was, I mean, I thought it was at first. I enjoyed the students. I enjoyed teaching. There's so much politics in higher ed and
Hmm.
so much, I just, it's too much. It was too much. Especially when we got involved in the closing of the program, and that got so political. And what I went from a setting where I worked 8:30 to 4:30. I didn't have to be on call. I didn't have to answer emails at home or anything. And when you're teaching, when you're an instructor, you're available all the time for the most part. Like
Hmm.
people are sending, I wasn't used to that. I wasn't used to getting emails, with all the time. And then you have to respond because they're waiting for you to respond to move forward with a project or paper or something.
Yeah.
So, and then you're reading all these papers and doing, preparing for classes, which I mean, I liked it until I think the whole process of the closing of the program really kind of was not helpful to my experience in higher ed. I am grateful for it. I really appreciate, the experience, and it's paid off because we do a lot of trainings now. We speak at a lot of different places. We just spoke at an international conference in Indianapolis, the Critical Incident Team International Conference, and so that was, I think, my first international conference, and that's
Uh-huh.
exciting. So I keep
It
saying
is exciting.
I like that part of it because you teach in a way, you present, you teach, but you don't have to write paper, you don't have to read papers, you don't have to have rubrics, you don't have to, nobody's emailing you, for however many weeks, 15 weeks, 14 weeks of a semester. So you go, you do your thing, and then you can go and do it somewhere else again. So I appreciate I think that experience made me more confident in my presentation and my style of teaching.
So we're kind of coming up in a wrap on this interview, Lisa, and I want to give you the opportunity to be heard saying whatever it is you'd like to going out. Give people your website, of course, and let them know because I can tell you from experience, I was willing to travel pretty far to find a practitioner. And I think, anytime that people can reach out to someone and maybe get a referral or get some lifeline, it's a good thing.
For sure. I think, Randy, what I want to kind of finish with, I did a podcast recently with um, a police lieutenant, I think it was, but I did a podcast with him, and what I ended up coming to what I wanted to say to people, I think, is that there is hope, there is help, and there is healing. And I think sometimes everybody's on a different path for that. And when you find that you need that, I think that it's so important that there's people that you can, like you said, to reach out to. But I think hope is one of the things that, it's an interesting term. And I used to think people, when they're depressed, when they've experienced things that they haven't been able to deal with, they become hopeless.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that's a scary thing. That's a scary thing, to be hopeless. And I think that people that come for help must have some level of hope that something's going to help. And I used to say that, like when I worked in the partial program, we would talk about people, they would talk about being hopeless. And I'm like, would you be here if you didn't have some level of hope that this might help?
Yeah.
And I think we fail to realize that, there is some hope if somebody's showing up in your office. And I think it's our job to lift that hope up somehow and help them lift that hope up. And I think that the hope and the help leads to healing. And like you mentioned, that healing and everybody's journey is different. But if people can walk away feeling that they've been heard, that their feelings and their experiences have been validated and acknowledged by somebody else, that I think one of the terms that I like to use is that we hold space for people.
Yeah.
I hold space for people in my office. I think we hold space for people in different ways. And here I find I'm holding space for their stories and what they need to get better and to feel better and to be able to move forward. And I think that's a gift. I think it's an honor. I think I don't know what, I'm not sure how to really put it into words, how much meaning that has when you're with people and they're sharing things that they might have never shared with anybody else before, or they're at a point where they need help. And I like to be able to say, I got you.
Yeah.
And we're going to do this together. You're not alone in this. And I think that that's so important. That's such an important part of the work. And you can look at theories, and there's been studies. You can look at theories. You can look at, EMDR. You can look at cognitive behavioral therapy. You can look at all those. And there's been studies, and we know that they work. But the biggest part of therapy is the rapport you build between me and you.
Exactly.
And then you add the therapy on top of that. Because if you don't trust me, then you're not going to open up to me. And I need to be trustworthy, right? And so I think it's an honor, and I have trouble finding words for it, because it's a sacred space sometimes, for sure.
It is. It is very much a sacred space. Yeah.
Yeah.
It is the place where we kind of open up our souls.
Coming back to what you started with, that hole in the soul, the hole in the soul. We're trying to fill that, and sometimes we have to fill that with acceptance of what has happened, and figuring out how to move forward with it, and not have it control and consume our lives.
Yeah. That is my honor, is to be able to talk to you today and to share this. And for those of you out there, because I know we go all over the world with this podcast, this video will go out and it'll go all different places. The theme of this is largely, this is a journey, and life's journey is painful, and sometimes you need help. And the hope is part of that help to be able to heal. My guest, Lisa Zoll, give your website real quickly.
www.griefrelieftherapy.com.
That's if you are in Pennsylvania or the southern central region of Pennsylvania, you can reach out there. And to all of you, this was kind of me sharing part of my journey as well. I hope I expressed it well enough that you get the sense that there are miracles, there are things that happen, and there's a time and a place to deal with things. And that's going to close it out for this session on Off Planet Radio. I'm Randy Maugans. The truth is out there. It's inside you now. Go find it.